Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Lunch and Learn webinar, Heat Illness Prevention, Best Practices and Resources for Compliance with Colorado Rules. I'm Adrian Card, State Specialist in Produce with Colorado State University Extension and founding board member of the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. This webinar is produced in collaboration with CFVGA and will feature best practices to prevent heat-related illness and resources to comply with the new Colorado labor laws. CFVGA is the go-to resource for Colorado's fresh fruit and vegetable farmers. We connect Colorado growers with industry, government, academia, and consumers to strengthen and expand Colorado fresh fruit and vegetable production. Learn more at CFVGA's website and follow CFVGA on the 2 social media links shown on the screen. CFVGA would like to thank its sponsors, and I'm going to show these to you here briefly. Platinum sponsors on screen now, gold sponsors, silver sponsors, and more silver sponsors. All of these funders make possible the work that Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association does and the collaboration that Colorado State University Extension has with that association and the synergies that we make possible. You can learn more about these vendors at the CFVGA website by going to the Growers tab and look at its directory of products and services. We will be fielding your questions through a Q&A box. Whitney has given me the go-ahead to interject some of your questions at my discretion. So as we're going, go ahead and type them in. It's set so that you'll be able to see everyone else's questions, and you can upvote those as well. Resize Zoom as is appropriate to your device that you're using, and we will have some polls through the presentation as well. Our presenter today is Whitney Pennington in her role as Outreach Coordinator for the High Plains Intermountain Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. Whitney promotes best practices for farm safety, particularly those identified through the center's research. Whitney enjoys the challenges of translating research findings into real-world applications that help people stay safe at work and at home. Whitney earned her master's in public health from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and has 10 years experience in science and risk communication. And with that, Whitney, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. And just like Adrian mentioned, we're going to be covering heat illness prevention and specifically those best practices and some resources for you for compliance with Colorado's new heat rules. So if you've heard me speak on this topic before, just bear with me. The first few minutes is an introduction that you may have heard before, but the bulk of what we're going to do is go rule piece by rule piece. Break that down and provide some examples of compliance and resources based on what I have seen over the last year and some other ideas that were up in my head. And then we'll close out and leave time for questions. But please go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A box if you're with us live. And Adrian will moderate those. And if you're watching on the recording, my email is at the end of this presentation, and you'll be able to reach out to me that way to discuss more. So before we get started on all of that, I did want to start with a bit of getting us all on the same page of why we're even talking about issues of occupational health and safety. And for me, the top line is that whether you're working with 2 people who are your family members or whether you're employing, a couple hundred workers, the common denominator is that you're working with people, and all people deserve safe and healthy work, and they deserve to go home from work in the same condition that they arrived at work in. But also there is a business benefit to having health and safe people, and that's that healthy people are more productive. And I mean healthy in the whole realm of well-being. So, physical, emotional, social, financial well-being. When people have that well-being, they just perform better. So it behooves us to, as business owners, to invest in those people's well-being. Finally, safety is everyone's responsibility. Yes, individuals make choices and they are responsible for those choices, but people who are owners, supervisors, managers, they play a big role in creating that environment in which those choices are made. And we call that across occupations, the safety culture. And so how is safety prioritized, and how are people given the resources, the training, the motivation they need to make a safe choice every single time? So I'm going to get into now what heat illness is, and just a word that heat illness, heat-related illness, abbreviated as HRI, those are the same thing. The words are used interchangeably. So it's not meant to confuse you if I'm talking about two different things. It's all the same thing. We are exposed to two different kinds of heat. We have the heat from the environment, like air temperature and sunlight. And then we also have metabolic heat, which is the heat that our bodies, that our muscles generate when we do activity. These two things combined are what we call heat stress, which is the net load of heat that's on our bodies. And then our body's natural response to try to maintain its ideal temperature is called heat strain. So things like sweating. And then when our body's ability to counteract that heat is overwhelmed, and the heat stress is too much, we spill over into heat-related illness. So that's a range of things, mild like cramps and rash, to severe life-threatening emergencies, fainting, dizziness, slurring of speech. We're talking about heat-related illness in particular. No surprise to you, you know this. The impact is significant on ag workers because majority of the work, especially in Colorado produce, is done at our peak summer temperatures. And so we know that between 2000 and 2010, the rate of heat-related deaths for workers in the agriculture sector was 35 times higher than it was in other industries. We also know in the last 20 years, at least 65 crop workers have died due to an occupational heat-related illness. And we expect this impact to continue into the future. In general, heat illness and cases of heat illness increase with temperature. In warmer summers, there are more cases, and our global temperatures are rising. Depending on what data source you look at, here in the United States, 5 to 7 of the hottest years on record have all been in the last 10 years. So our impact is likely going to grow. When we talk about heat illness, we also need to be aware of some risk factors, and those risk factors can be divided into personal, work, and weather categories, and knowing these risk factors is a step towards prevention. So I'm just going to kind of gloss over these and speak in generalities, but the personal category, a lot of these have to do with being dehydrated. So whether you're in some sort of condition or illness that makes you dehydrated, if you have a chronic disease that makes you likely dehydrated, or if you take certain medicines that are likely to dehydrate you. There are some pieces specifically of agricultural work that have risk factors. People get up early and they need caffeine and other beverages to help keep them going and keep them awake at that early hour. Those beverages are usually not ideal for hydration. We might work around hot machines. Our packing sheds might not have ideal ventilation, or because of other hazards and risks involved, we're wearing heavy clothing, personal protective equipment. There's also, I've added in with these bullets, some risk factors associated with piece rate work, and agriculture isn't the only industry that uses piece rate work. Some folks, manufacturing, etc., do as well. But this kind of whole area relates to breaks, and piece rate work we know disincentivizes breaks because you're not paid when you're not working. And so you're gonna not choose to do anything that would take you away from work, including breaking to drink water Or if your bathroom is really far away, if you have to walk to that bathroom, you're not going to spend the time to walk there, and you're not going to spend the time to drink water that would cause you to have to walk there. For us in Colorado, our weather risk factors are really related to direct sunlight. We get a lot of sunlight, and thankfully we don't have much humidity. So now I'm going to move into talking about prevention, and specifically looking at the Colorado Ag Labor Conditions Rule, which this rule came about with the passage of Senate Bill 2187 in 2021. Colorado Department of Labor and Employment was charged with kind of creating these rules and this prevention program. And this is the rule that was put into effect last May. So I've broken it down into kind of 8 buckets, is kind of what I see it as. So I'm going to overview them now, and then we'll go bucket by bucket to talk about the rule as well as provide my compliance ideas. So the first is that ag employers have to monitor the outdoor and indoor temperature, and specifically look for where it goes over about 80 degrees, goes over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. When that happens, you have to provide drinking water, to provide shade. You have to maintain effective communication. You have to monitor people for symptoms of heat-related illness. You have to have a proper and immediate response when you do have reports of those symptoms. You have to provide employee training annually. And you have to provide an additional break in some stipulated increased risk conditions. So now breaking those down and teasing them apart, I think Adrian just put in the chat the link to the actual regulatory language. What I'm sharing today is sort of interpretation of that. So always go back to the actual rule if you have any questions. So for temperature, we're looking at a temperature threshold that is or is forecasted to be 80 degrees Fahrenheit for prompting you for what provisions you need to make for, say, the next day. You have to do this on a daily basis. And if you're relying on just a forecast, say today's Wednesday, you're relying on, okay, what do I need to plan to provide for tomorrow? Do I need to provide water? Do I need to do extra breaks? You have to use that forecast from no earlier than noon. So it's afternoon now when we're recording this on a Wednesday, so I could start planning based on current forecasts for Thursday. So compliance ideas, there are tons of apps that tell you the weather. Chances are you probably already have one on your phone, and that works. I've specifically pulled up this OSHA NIOSH heat safety tool. It's a weather app specifically for folks who are trying to prevent heat-related illness or monitoring prevention programs for heat-related illness. You'll see in the middle of the screen, there's a big temperature. And then my yellow circle is actually circling the top left of the screen because this app shows you temperature in the middle there based on heat index, which that is a temperature that combines humidity with temperature. For Colorado, the rule does not use heat index. It uses what we would call dry bulb temperature, or the regular temperature that you would open an app and see. This app does give you both. So in that circle where there's that little thermometer symbol, that's the dry bulb temperature, and it's pulling that based on your location. There are a plethora of devices and monitors commercially available on the market that do similar things that you could put in your work environment. Some of them even have alarms, and it would start beeping and going off when certain temperatures are met, a threshold that you set. You'll see throughout, as I'm explaining, I have this bullet of assign as duty and use a log, I think on every single screen. And the idea here is just to get you thinking about how do you ensure compliance at your place of business? Does it need to be written into someone's job description? Does there need to be some sort of log or checkoff or physical thing that something needs to do in order to ensure that it gets done? Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. So it's just something for you to be thinking about as we talk about this is not only how am I creating the structure for compliance, but then how am I also ensuring that it gets done. Next, we have the provision of drinking water. So once you hit that 80-degree threshold, or if the forecast for tomorrow says it's going to be above 80 degrees, you have to provide drinking water. And specifically 32 ounces per hour per employee. That's like a half Nalgene size. That has to be cool water, which is defined as 60 degrees or cooler. It has to be from a sanitary source, and excuse me, people have to have the time to drink it. I think most folks probably have what is in the picture here, which is that big water cooler, typically a 5-gallon jug that they put water and ice in. I have seen people use both sort of traditional ice cubes, but also I've seen a farm that used a giant solid block of ice. I don't know whether that's just the only thing that was available to them, or whether they had done something to determine that melted slower, and so it kept the water at a better temperature than using ice cubes. These 5-gallon jugs, to do some math for you, 5 gallons is 640 ounces, which if we divide that by the 32 ounces per employee per hour, that means that every one of these jugs has what I would call a 20 employee hour amount in it. So that would be like 20 hours of water for one employee, or we could break that down into 4 hours of water for 5 employees, because 5 times 4 is 20, if you get my drift. That's just to help you think about planning of how much water you need to have based on your crew size and the time you're going to be out, and at what point you need to make sure that you're refilling if necessary. You might also choose to provide a cooler with bottled water in it. This regulation does not require you to provide a sports drink or an electrolyte beverage, though best practice says that especially if people are sweating and working for a long time, at least some supplementation of water with a sports drink is better for them. My main point here is that you want to be sure you're providing something for people to drink it with as well. In this picture, this employer has provided those little single serve cups. I know that this creates a garbage item too, right? And so now you're going to have a garbage bag to put those cups in so they don't blow away. Figuring out, what is it that you're going to do in order to make sure that everyone has their own cup to drink from or sanitary source to drink from, because if I don't have a vehicle with which to get that water in my body, I'm less likely to drink it. So that's just something for you to consider. And here in our, again, assign as duty bullet, who's making sure that this gets to the field, that it gets filled, that it has ice in it, that it gets checked for if it needs to be refilled, and that it gets emptied and dried at the end of each day. This, I think, is one where, because everyone will be consuming the water, it's a really broad shared responsibility. So instead of this being assigned to a specific supervisor or those duties assigned to a supervisor, this might be something that is sort of more loose and a more shared responsibility that passes among team members, crew members. When it's above 80, you also have to provide shade. So that shade can be natural or artificial. It has to be as close as practical to the work site, which that's also true of water. I left that out. It has to be away from a heat source, so it can't be a running machine. It has to be ventilated, open to the air, and it has to be large enough that it accommodates all employees comfortably. So this one, unlike water, I think water is pretty straightforward. There aren't that many iterations of how you could provide water, whereas providing shade, I think we start to see some major differences based on the size of your operation. So these are some things that I've seen over the past year that I wanted to highlight. Some, again, if you're a larger operation, probably you have equipment and harvest aids that already have maybe canopies on them, or already are in themselves sort of naturally shading. And so your break time would be to turn that structure off, right? So that's not generating heat and everyone hangs out under the shade that's already there for their break. Maybe you need to create some sort of permanent or movable shade structure. So it could be as simple as, well, we're pretty a small operation or a small size. Our, machine shed, storage shed has an awning and a patio on it already. Do I just need to buy some tables to make that a more inviting place that people can go to and enjoy and be comfortable in the shade? Do I need to sink some telephone poles and string up a canopy in the center of the property and create a more permanent shaded location? This picture here is of our team down on a farm this summer. This is one of those pop-up ones for camping that I own. And so I brought it for our team to use. These are available in, lots of different quality, I guess I'll say, from $50 up to hundreds of dollars. And I saw other farms using these as well. And then it gets put in a truck, it gets put in the bus, or it gets strapped to the porta potty trailer if you're going to move around to a new location. Or this is an example from California, from a larger farm. You're already pulling porta potties. Some of you might already be pulling a porta potty around, a trailer with porta potties. Can you take a trailer and add an awning and put a picnic bench on it? So just like you're moving your bathrooms around to all of your sites, you're also moving this shade structure around. And so there you are bringing the shade to your fields, depending on where you're going to be working.
Whitney, one thing Marilyn Drake, CFEGA Executive Director, wanted us to note in the recording is that if workers finish before the temperature reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that no additional measures need to be taken according to Senate Bill 87 in Colorado, even if the day is forecast to exceed 80 degrees. That was something that the CFEGA negotiated during rulemaking. So
that's correct. So if your crew is only going to be working from 6 a.m. to noon, and the hourly forecast says 80 isn't going to be until 3 p.m. And your crew isn't going to be out at 3 p.m. You are not legally required to provide these things. Thank you for that. So these next few pieces kind of all fit together. So they might be a little wonky as I explain them, but we'll kind of do a bigger wrap up at the end. But this next piece is you need to make sure you have effective communication. So effective communication is defined as either by voice, by talking to each other, by observing things, or by using your phone and electronic means. And the reason you have effective communication is because you need to make sure that you can verify people's well-being and that you can contact medical care or reach out to EMS in case of an emergency. So here, I think what you want to do is maybe first step, you probably already know this, make sure you have cell coverage. If you're relying on an electronic means of communication, can you use that electronic means across your property? How does your crew prefer to electronically communicate? Is that by WhatsApp? Does everyone have each other's contacts? Is there a designated crew contact when something goes wrong? Who are we communicating to? Who is our point of contact on the crew who's going to be in the field with us? And do I know how to get a hold of them? And then who is sort of the next supervisor up? I have on here corresponding quote, office staff for two reasons. One would be who is sort of the next chain of command in the management structure who needs to know. But also, if you are in the position where you don't have great cell coverage, but you have a landline in your office, how are you planning out or thinking through, okay, if we don't have great coverage here, how are we going to get in contact with the person who does have good service so that we can call EMS or they can call EMS? So you have to have effective communication because you're going to monitor and receive reports of signs and symptoms of heat-related illness. And the rule here actually gives you some compliance ideas. It says you can have your supervisors observe people, monitor them to make sure that they're well. And if you do that, You should have supervisors monitoring no more than 20 people at a time. So some of your crews might actually need 2 people who have this responsibility. You might choose to break your crew up into smaller groups, even buddies, and let people know that they're responsible for checking in on each other. A thing to think about is the people who are working alone. Maybe it's an irrigator who's going out to a field in the heat of the day on their own. How are you staying in touch with them, and how are you receiving reports? What's your process for them checking in on you, or you checking in on them to say, hey, are you still feeling okay? You might already have that process, right? Maybe it's you're texting each other. Maybe there's some, if you're feeling fancy, a fancy, shared digital app that, someone can check when they've done stuff, and they can check in via app that everyone can see. And again, here, do we need to assign this as someone's duty? Certainly, if you're going to go with the first one of having your supervisors be responsible for this, that's something to consider. And is there any sort of log structure, even like a check mark, that people need to do to make sure that it happened? So again, we're communicating effectively, we're monitoring and receiving reports, because when people have signs and symptoms, we need to have a proper and immediate response. So the first part of this is whether you have supervisors observing people, or employees observing each other, or whether someone comes and says, hey, I'm not feeling well. The first step in the immediate response is to get them out of the heat. And that's called a cool down rest in the language of the rule. And so an employee can initiate this. A supervisor can also initiate this, but this would be a break above and beyond what is in the comps order, or that 10 minutes every 4 hours. Again, the idea being I can get them out of the environmental heat, get them away from their metabolic heat, or stop generating metabolic heat as an emergency response procedure if they're not feeling well. That person needs to be monitored during their break, right? Depending on the severity, they might not need to be babysat, but if they're really not well, someone does need to stay with them. And if someone, again, is severe, if they're not in their right mind, if they're slurring speech, they're not coherent, they have fainted, they're unresponsive, that's a medical emergency, and emergency medical services needs to be contacted. So our compliance with this is really kind of goes in the same communication. These really are all both together. What is your standard operating procedure for how you're communicating in case of emergency? If you have, if you're out in the middle of a field, who's working on making sure that that person gets to a spot where you can meet EMS? Does EMS know how to get to you? If you have multiple farm sites, ABC Farm, has fields and, 6 different places across 6 different miles. Is there a list? And I realize you probably want to keep this private, but is there a list with what the address is, or what the cross streets are, or what the GPS coordinates are, that you can communicate better with emergency medical services and alleviate some of that downtime or lost time to in rural areas, especially how do I find where this person is that they might need help? So in general, for farm emergency preparedness, what the picture on the screen is like a map, a farm map that you would make. That is more time intensive and maybe beyond the scope of what is required here, but it's just to get sort of the gist of you thinking about those logistics. So now is the time for my first poll. Adrian, if you would put this up, your first poll says, I already have the resources gathered and a plan for conducting my annual heat illness prevention training with my employees and supervisors. Our next section is going to be on training, so that's why you're getting this prompt. Right.
And Whitney, looks like we got a few that responded here, and one yes and one doesn't know.
Doesn't know.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, whether you know or whether you don't know, you're going to know now. So this next section is on training and what those resources are. So the training portion of the rule stipulates all your employees have to be trained in 5 areas. I'm not going to go bullet by bullet here. High level summary, 4 of them. The first 4 are the very basics of what heat-related illness is. How do I respond to it? How do I treat it? That sort of generic training. And then the 5th element is training you have to provide on all of the rights under the ag labor conditions rules, which there are many things that are even beyond the scope of this presentation. And then you also have to provide information on your site-specific compliance. Excuse me, what are the specific things that you're going to be doing? How are you complying with shade, water, breaks, those kind of things? But note that this last piece of what rights are and the site-specific compliance, that can be done in writing. It doesn't need to be part of a formal training program. And then if you have supervisors who are taking on specific roles and responsibilities, they need to be trained on what those processes are and what those roles are. So to aid you in this, HICAUS and CFBGA adapted a training script that colleagues in California created that complies with the rule for agriculture there. And so this is a tailgate training style. So there are 5 short sort of units that have visual aids with them. And there are prompts within the script for you to write in and add in what your farm specific policies are going to be. You know, we're going to break in XYZ way. These are available, the scripts are available in English and Spanish. And you could do them, chances are, for your meet your annual training requirement at the beginning of the season. You could do them all 5 in a row at one time. You know, that would take maybe an hour and a half. Or, and you could keep, you know, the individual ones with specific topics in your back pocket. Maybe on a really hot day, you want to do a quick booster training on, you know, are we drinking enough water today? So if you do all 5 of those units and you post the written ag labor rights poster that CDLE has created, you will be meeting all of the requirements and be in compliance with all of the requirements under the CDLA rule. Maybe you don't want to do lead a training yourself. Maybe you would prefer to have people watch a video. Here is another resource for you. Sorry, I failed to mention, these resources are all on the CFEGA website. If you go to coloradoproduce.org/labor, I believe that link is in the chat as well. Under there's a table that has a bunch of different topics and categories. It has resources for those categories, and both of these resources are up there. But this video series, it's 5 short segments. It's 15 minutes in length. It has sort of workers in an orchard acting out some skits. And so they're speaking Spanish and there's English subtitles for those of you with bilingual crews. This meets the general requirement of what is heat-related illness and how will we respond. This is a generic video, so it doesn't have any room for you to add your site-specific compliance. So you will need to take care of doing that. And add, again, post the ag labor rights poster. And once you do those 2 things in conjunction with this video series, that's when you are then fully compliant with all the training requirements. And just to highlight, there is a training log that we've created that goes with the scripts that's available to you. You can use that training log with these videos. It's a generic log. So you write in what the training was that you did and when you did it, and people should initial and sign off that they attended the training.
Whitney, another question Marilyn Drake's asking, and you may not be familiar with this, but there's a CDLE worker, it's related to workers' comp insurance, a premium cost containment program, where the employer needs to provide and document specific trainings. Do you know if the Tailgate training program would help qualify growers for that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, don't like quote me on that, but I would think absolutely. After attending that webinar last week, 100%, he talked about doing that training and that compliance. This would be, that training log could go in your evidence package to show that you have been conducting trainings and had a safety plan, along with all of the times that I've mentioned. What is your standard operating procedure for XYZ? All of those things can go in that evidence package to get you part of that cost containment program.
Perfect. Thank you.
So a training video that is going to be coming soon, not quite done yet. Again, CFEGA and High Cause have worked on a short video to take you beyond training to this space of, once people know what to do, how do I actually help motivate them to do what is best practice and do what it is we want them to do? And so we use the process or the style of video where it's farm workers being interviewed and giving their advice to other farm workers. And so that is going to be available, I would say, in the order of days to 2 weeks, right? There are just some really nitty-gritty details to iron out. This will be located on YouTube, and there'll be a link to it in the same spot of all these resources that I've already mentioned on that labor page for CFVGA. So home stretch, the final rule piece to cover is the increased risk conditions. So when there are certain conditions met, when it's really hot, when under certain air quality advisories, if folks are going to be working a long day, if they're wearing heavy clothing, or if they're unacclimated, so in the first 4 days that they work, then you're going to have to provide an additional break. And that break is stipulated as an additional 10 minutes for every 2 hours that they're working, instead of every 4 hours. That's in the comps order. And you'll need to alert employees, again, that they have that right, that anytime they're really hot, they need to initiate their own cool down break, right? That if they're experiencing signs and symptoms, that they need to stop working to prevent a serious medical emergency. I don't really have any compliance suggestions on this. It's however you do breaks, right? Is it, someone has to keep track of in that first week of work that we're gonna only work 2 hours at a time, take some natural breaks, do what you need to do to make that possible and be intentional about it. So in closing, I'm excited we left plenty of times if there are more questions. My prompts to you this is the second year of this rule. Now is your time to start planning, but can you reflect on what worked last year? What didn't work last year? What can you do the same that you did last year? What do you need to change? It's all well and good that I've just provided you with some ideas, but I don't own a farm. And so pick up the phone, call your neighbor, go over to, who's the closest farm to you? What did they do? I think you're going to get that advice that may make more sense or be more practical by talking to someone else who's doing it, including your crew, right? If you have your supervisors, if you have H2A workers and they're coming in right about now, you're getting ready to have them in, or the first season, the early season folks, use the resources that is the knowledge among the people you employ. Also, as we just talked about in Marilyn's question about cost containment, document. Use your training log to the extent that you can, whatever standard operating procedure that you come up with, make sure that you have a written version of that, because those are the evidence that you can use and submit to the cost containment program for CDLE to potentially get a reduced workers' comp premium. I also want to just say thank you to you all for growing and and your teams for growing and supplying us with fresh fruits and vegetables. They're very much enjoyed in my household. So we do have another poll question. Adrian, I don't know if you want to do that right now, or if we want to do some questions first. I'll let you decide that.
We can just multitask here. Poll is launched, and Christy Bartolo has a question. If employees are working at night and it's still 80 degrees, do the same rules apply?
Yes, they do. I would say yes.
Okay.
We can have another conversation about some of the risks. There are additional risks, I think, of working at overnight hours. But I think the question there might be about shade, and how does shade apply at night? That might be a good question to ask CDLE for clarification, but I would think that you are relieved of shade because nighttime is shade. If that makes sense.
Yeah, you're not having solar energy load on
Yeah.
at that point. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would, don't mark me on this, but I would think that that's probably a pretty rare that nighttime in Colorado is above 80.
Probably some parts of the state where Christy's from in Arkansas
Yeah,
Valley,
I was thinking that too. The
much
southern
harder.
part, and yeah.
Sometimes it's get the Chinook wind kind of thing going on. Someone else is saying, excellent info, Whitney. Thank you very much. So you're getting some immediate kudos and some kudos here in the educational outcomes poll. And while we have Whitney, folks, are there any other questions? While you're pondering that, CFEGA will be planning a fall 2023 produce labor conference. So stay tuned for those details. And Whitney, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just want to say my contact is now up on the screen. As I go out of my contact is on the screen. If you want to reach out and you want to, talk more about best practices, I'm happy to have that conversation. Again, I recommend you also call your neighbors. High Cause, the center that I'm with CSU, our website, highcause.colostate.edu. We have resources on a number of different worker health and safety topics beyond just heat. If you want to check that out for what we have, we're also on social media and we share resources on social media that way. And I am really indebted to our colleagues that are in Washington and California because they have had a rule longer than we have, and we were able to step up some of these resources and provide them to you in very quick time last spring because we didn't reinvent the wheel and we took the great work that we did and just made it look and feel like Colorado.
Whitney is a huge resource for us in this subject and many others for worker health and safety. As you heard, she's tremendously well resourced and is creating some great educational products for us to help protect workers in the field. So Whitney, really appreciate you spending time with us today and helping unpack Senate Bill 87, the Agricultural Labor Rights and Responsibilities Act.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for coming, and stay tuned for future webinars with CFEGA. Have a great day.